All right, today we're diving into a really disturbing story out of Whitpain Township, Pennsylvania. It all kicks off with one very mysterious death, but believe me, it quickly spirals into a much bigger investigation of alleged corruption and secrecy in a local government. Let's break it all down.
So this whole thing really starts with an absolutely chilling statement, one that was allegedly made by a man named Dante Perez Jones to his own mother. It's a warning that kind of hangs over every single detail of the case that followed.
The story itself begins back in June of 2022 with the death of a U.S. Army veteran, Dante Perez Jones. He was found in a public park which is located, get this, directly next to the township's police station. Now, right away, the location itself is, well, it's pretty suspicious, right? A park right next to a police station, you'd think it would be under heavy surveillance. In fact, the podcast guest we're covering claims there are over 100 cameras in that area. And yet, when the family asked for footage, the authorities claimed they had none, not a single frame.
And this is where you can really see the two stories clashing. The official story was suicide by hanging, but the podcast guest points to a whole list of really troubling inconsistencies. Jones was allegedly found just leaning against playground equipment with his feet flat on the ground. Despite those 100-plus cameras, no footage. The crime scene was reportedly cleared in under an hour, and an autopsy was apparently refused at first until public pressure forced them to do one.
And the questions, they just keep piling up. For one, Jones was from an hour away and had no known ties to this township. No wallet or suicide note was ever found. There were reports of visible bruises on his body. And his car? Never located. On top of all that, he didn't sound like a man at the end of his rope. He was reportedly really excited about a new career and had plans to spend the summer with his kids. So you have to ask, right? Was this just a straightforward tragedy, or do all these inconsistencies point to something way more sinister? This is the very question that pushed one local resident to start digging deep into his town's government. Now, what's interesting is that the podcast guest who put all these allegations together, he didn't even start with the Dante Jones case. His own story, he claims, kicked off with a crime at his own home that he says the local authorities just completely botched.
He lays out a pretty clear timeline of events. First, his house was broken into, and he had the whole thing on camera. Second, and this is the crazy part, despite what he calls just overwhelming evidence, video, threatening texts, even blood left at the scene, he claims the police filed what was basically a traffic ticket against one person and charged the other one with nothing at all. So when he pushed the DA's office for answers, he says they just went silent. This is what forced him to launch a federal lawsuit and a website to get his story out there.
And this is where his personal story just explodes into something much bigger. His website, which was initially just about his own case, started getting all these anonymous tips from other residents, all sharing their own troubling experiences with the township government. A pattern was definitely starting to emerge.
This brings us right into a series of other really strange incidents in the township that, according to the podcast guest, fit into a systemic pattern of alleged misconduct, secrecy, and intimidation.
For example, take the story of Jay Van. Now, at the time, he was allegedly the only black police officer on the entire Whitpain Township police force, and then one day he just vanished. Poof, gone. The story only even came to light because a volunteer was digging through old township meeting transcripts and found this really cryptic reference to a legal settlement. It wasn't listed under a person's name. It was listed under this employee #1046. So, the allegation is that employee number 1046 was actually Officer Jay Van. The story goes he abruptly disappeared from the force, and all records, photos, any mention of his employment were allegedly scrubbed, like he never even existed. A secret settlement was paid out using taxpayer money, but the reason for it and the amount were never disclosed to the public. But the pattern we're talking about isn't just about these quiet, secret settlements. The podcast guest claims it extends to the active harassment of citizens and businesses, using the tools of local government to target people they see as weak or, problematic.
And his alleged harassment apparently takes all kinds of forms. In one federal zoning case, a business owner claimed he was told his roller rink would be blocked specifically to keep black people out. In another example, citizens who spoke out against the government were suddenly hit with these petty code violations, fines for an expired dog license or grass that was a little too high. And then there's the story of a father who claims he was roughed up by police who then took his phone and just deleted the photos he'd taken of the incident.
So you're probably wondering, how does all this stuff connect? A mysterious death, a mishandled break-in, a vanishing police officer, targeted harassment? Well, the podcast guest ties it all together with a theory he calls the shadow organization.
So what is that? He basically describes it as this unofficial power structure that's humming along right under the surface. Elected officials might come and go, but the real power, he argues, is held by unelected, long-term employees who operate behind the scenes. And this kind of structure can absolutely thrive at the local level precisely because there's often less media scrutiny and lower public engagement, which allows that kind of influence to get really entrenched over decades.
After all of his research and experiences, the guest boils it all down into one pretty blunt assessment. He really doesn't mince words about how he believes these systems operate.
And he makes this really interesting point that this kind of deep-rooted corruption is actually easier to pull off at the local level. He cites a lobbyist who explained that trying to influence the federal government is tough. There are just too many players. But at the state and local level, it's much, much simpler. With fewer people involved, there's just more room for manipulation.
Okay, so this all brings us to the final, and honestly, maybe the most important takeaway from this whole story: why these fights, in small towns you've probably never even heard of, actually matter to all of us. And the core argument is simple, but it's really powerful. Look, we all spend so much time and energy focused on national politics, right? But the power that actually shapes our day-to-day lives, the quality of our police force, the fairness of our zoning laws, the ability to get a simple permit, all of that is wielded in our local town halls. And that really leaves us with this one big, provocative question. One that goes way beyond this one township in Pennsylvania. After hearing all these allegations of a shadow government and systemic intimidation, it's a question we should probably all be asking ourselves. Do you know who really runs your town?